Hello, global gardeners. I hope you're doing well on this Monday. It is frigid over much of the United States and Canada. You can see in the comments the low temperatures everybody is experiencing, including me. Went outside this morning and it was warming up already to -5 Fahrenheit. That's -20 Celsius. And it's not going to get much warmer through the day. So, what does that mean? It means it's a great opportunity to stay indoors and think about seeds, talk about seeds, maybe even start some seeds. And we can all be a bit envious with Rick in Australia, even though it's 3 a.m. right now. It's nowhere near as cold during their summer as we're experiencing during our winter. Today, we're going to focus on a specific mindset when it comes to our seeds, and that's when to start the seeds, both indoors and outdoors. Right off the bat, let's try to make it as simple as possible. I like seed companies that have seed packets with all the information you need, and those good seed packets will tell you when to start your seeds. So, there you have it. That's all the information you need, right? Just look at the seed packet and it'll tell you to start your tomatoes 6 to 8 weeks before your last frost date, or start your peppers 8 to 12 weeks before your last frost date. It's as simple as that, right? Well, there's a key piece of information there that's on the seed packets. And we've talked about it before, but I really want to stress it again today. When you follow the basic guidance of when to start your seeds, either indoors or outdoors, much of the advice is centered around your last frost date. I've said this in videos before, and I've said it on live streams. Your last frost date is probably the most important date on your gardening calendar for the entire year. So much of what we do is based on that date. So I think most of us can tell each other right off the bat what our last frost date is, because if you've been gardening for a while, that should be one that's committed to memory. I use May 18th here in Colorado as my last frost date. I know many of you have similar dates. Some are earlier, not very many are later, but it gives us that guidance moving into spring to start our seeds. Now, when you look at much warmer environments like Australia, for instance, Australia does have different zones. They've got summer, they've got winter, but of course, they're not experiencing these severe freezes that some of us have. And it tends to be much more gradual. So there still will be a last frost date, but there's much more latitude when it comes to your planting. For me here in Colorado, I almost literally go from a cold spring to a hot summer overnight. It happens very quickly. So I can have my last frost in the middle or end of May, and in the beginning or middle of June, we'll have skyrocketing temperatures. It's that abrupt. If you live in an area where it is more gradual, where the days are warming, you have a nice spring, you have the possibility that temperatures might drop a bit to freezing or frost conditions. You can plan the same way using your last frost date, but all it takes is a little bit extra protection, some plastic over your plants to be able to overcome those frosty days. For the rest of us that have snow and hard freezes, often up to the end, it becomes very critical that we don't put things in the ground until we reach the magic window. And that window is all centered around our last frost date. So start with your last frost date and then look at that seed packet, look at the catalog, read the information from the books that you have about seeds, and that'll give you an idea of when to actually start your seeds. Now, That's the basics. That's the baseline for our planning. There are other factors that we need to bring into play when we're deciding the best date to start our seeds. What kind of seeds are they? Are they flower seeds? Are they vegetable seeds? If you want to be growing a plant that gives you flowers, like a perennial plant, most perennials are going to take at least a year to get established and maybe not even flower until the second year. So you've got a lot of variability on when you can start those plants based on how big you want that plant to be when you put it out in your garden. If you're growing a flowering plant and you want it to already have flowers on it when you put in your garden, that's going to affect when you start your seeds as well. We're spoiled. We go to the garden center, we go to the nurseries, we see the petunias and the pansies and the snapdragons, all those wonderful flowers from all those wonderful plants. We buy the plant, we put the plant in the garden already flowering. And then we'll have flowers from those plants pretty much through the rest of the season. If you don't take that into account when you're starting the seeds, let's say you want to start those same flower seeds, if you follow the basic recommendation from a seed packet, it's going to tell you when to start the seed to get a plant that is suitable for transplanting at or near the last frost date. Probably not even close to blooming yet. So if you want a flowering plant already in bloom, you're going to have to back up that date by weeks, maybe even a couple months. And that's the kind of thing that often comes from experience, because you're not going to see those dates recommended in most of the advisory sources. I'll be talking about vegetables in just a bit. Let's go ahead and take a look and see if we've got any comments that have popped up. Hello to Heidi. Well, it's great to have you here today as one of our fantastic moderators. There are other events that are happening today. I haven't seen Jay check on yet, but I'm sure that she's glued to the television set right now. It's interesting to see all of the cold, almost everybody, even Tennessee Nana at 5 degrees Fahrenheit. That is going to be my high today, minus 15 Celsius. That's just crazy how much the variance is, but almost everybody is cold. Rick says they are at 31 Celsius in Sydney. So to give you an idea, that's about 88 degrees Fahrenheit at 3 o'clock in the morning. So very, very cold. Liz is in Norway. No doubt that Liz has cold conditions there as well. It's going to be challenging for those of us to get through these next few days, but we can do it because we can focus on those gardening activities indoors, like with the seeds. Christine is saying, I need help starting onion seeds indoors and when to pot up. So this is that other piece, and this fits perfectly with what I was leading into, because I talked about putting flowers out in the garden already in bloom or as the size plant you want. And that's when you start your seeds. It works the same way with the vegetable gardens that we're going to be growing during spring, summer, and fall. And we want to start our seeds to correspond to the best point that we want those plants going out into our garden. So, Christine, I have a video that shows how to start onion seeds and talks a little bit about putting them outdoors. And I've got a video, in fact, about how I collected the seeds from some of those onions that I grew in the garden. When I grow my onion seeds, those are one of those that basic guidance tells you to start generally in the January, February timeframe. They're slow to germinate, they're slow to grow, and you really do want them as a pretty good size plant when it comes time to transplant. And so when it comes to starting them, you can check out in the video, but the basic idea is very shallow in the soil and get them germinating. A little bit of warm temperature will help with the germination of onion seeds and all seeds for that matter. And then just let them grow. And you want them to grow into a nice plant. I like to have an onion about 6 inches tall at transplanting. And then when you put them out in your garden, still is centered around that last frost date. Now, onions, in addition to a number of other plants like brassicas, for instance, brassicas are a perfect example of plants that can be started indoors and then be put outside like onions before your last frost date. So the soil can still be cool, the air can still be cool, the nighttime can actually be cold, and you can be putting those plants out in your garden. So, a few weeks before your last frost date is kind of a good target for when you want to get those kind of plants outside, to include the onions. If you want a bigger plant, then you would start earlier. If you are looking long term, then you might want to start your seeds outdoors now, for instance. You could actually sow onion seeds outdoors when it's frozen, when it's snowy and cold. And as the ground temperature warms up and as the air temperature warms up, those onion seeds will germinate in place in your garden beds in the springtime. And you don't even have to worry about transplanting. I think I mentioned this last week or at the end of last year, talking about onions at the Galileo garden. And that's what I would do. I would just let the seeds fall to the ground over the winter, and then they would start growing naturally in springtime. And it saves that extra step of the transplanting. Key difference here when we talk about starting our seeds indoors and outdoors. When you start your seeds indoors under controlled conditions, the nice warm temperatures of your household, the lights you're going to put them under, you tend to get very high germination rates. When you just scatter seeds outdoors in winter sowing, you're probably going to get very low germination rate. So be ready for that, along with insects and animals that are going to be eating those seeds that you're sowing outdoors. The weather, temperature, the moisture levels, the rain, the snow, all of those are going to be factors in how well your seeds germinate during the cold months. And just be ready for some loss when it comes to outdoor sowing, when you just randomly sow like that. If you treat your outdoor seed sowing like you would indoor sowing, where you try to have the controlled conditions, you want the warmth, you want the good soil, you want the appropriate light levels, then you can expect better germination. So I start all my squash seeds, all my melon seeds, all of my cucumber seeds, all of my corn seeds, my pea seeds, all of the basic plants in my summer garden. I start from seed outdoors. And the key component to get that successful germination is to make sure all of those factors, those control factors, to be as suitable as possible for the seed. So last week we talked about the basics of what the seed needs. As long as you're providing a nice warm soil and adequate moisture and plenty of sunlight, those seeds are going to germinate and start growing in place in your garden. The last frost date again becomes important, because when you put some of those seeds, like the squash seeds and the melon seeds and the cucumber seeds, into your garden, you're going to be doing those after your last frost date, after your soil has started to warm up and the temperature is suitable for those seeds to germinate. So do keep those thoughts in mind as we continue the conversation as to the conditions that you have control over. Now, you can say, yeah, you don't have control over the weather, the sun, what's happening outside when you sow those seeds, but you do have control over when you put those seeds into the soil. And that's the key part of the discussion today. Is the conditions may be variable outside, but you have complete control over the time you choose to take advantage of the positive aspects of your climate and of your weather. I'm Just Stardust is saying, I don't understand why land races are not more popular. It's important, I feel like, with the current problems we face. Thank you for the video you made about them. Have a nice day. Well, thank you for that. So I did a video last year about land race gardening. And if you didn't see that, the basic concept is that you're growing plants, you're allowing them to cross-pollinate, you're saving the seeds, or you're letting the seeds just fall naturally, and then those plants start growing again. And you really take advantage of how the genetics of the offspring will change over time. So as an example, we'll use the squash. And I think this is what I talked about primarily in that video. If you're growing one type of squash, let's say a zucchini, and you like the nice, long, cylindrical, dark green zucchini, that's wonderful. I love that. Black Beauty zucchini is one of my favorites. I grow it often, and it has a place in my garden. If you were growing a different type of zucchini, like a golden zucchini, I love my golden zucchini as well, they can be expected to cross-pollinate. So if you're growing both in your garden, and I do this often, growing both types in my garden, and they cross-pollinate, the resulting seed is going to be hybridized between the two parents, assuming, and most likely, you're going to get pollen from one of the male flowers on one of the plants and one of the female flowers on the other plant. And so if you save those seeds and plant them, what you're planting is going to be a hybrid. And you don't know what that's going to be. It may end up being a light green zucchini. It might be a dark green zucchini with the characteristics and taste of that yellow zucchini. Landrace gardening says embrace that. If it survived to grow in your garden and you were able to harvest the fruit from it, then it's telling you that that plant likes your garden. And so if you do more of that, where you just accept some of that pollination, you accept that some plants are going to do worse and some are going to do better. And if you start focusing on the plants that are doing better and then allowing them to adapt to your environment, what you're going to have is a more successful garden. You're going to have plants that are doing well in your specific environment, with your weather, with your soil, with the way you garden. And that's kind of the idea behind landrace gardening. I think it's a great concept. And I think actually to your point is the reason landrace is not more popular is because people don't understand it. It's one of those things that when I did that video last year, a large number of the comments were, I'd never heard of this before. And as I talked about it with some of my gardening friends, experienced gardeners as well had never heard about it before. So I think it's not as popular is because it's just unknown. And until we start talking about it, and until we start experimenting with it and seeing what works in our own garden, most gardeners are not going to know about it. And so I think, and this is what I said in the video, I think it's a great idea if you've got the space in your garden to experiment with that. Intentionally allow some of your plants to cross-pollinate and save the seeds, and then plant those seeds the next year and see what results you get. And you might be surprised. The stories of gardeners who are really avid land racers tell about these new fruits, these new squashes, these new melons that they are now growing that are sensational, and they're very unique to each garden setting. So I think it's just a fascinating opportunity for gardeners to experience if it's one of those things that you are interested in. And I think it is something that you could be interested in if you give it a try. And Trolled is saying in Oslo, Norway, that they're right at freezing right now, 0 Celsius and 32 Fahrenheit. So glad you're having a mild winter. We've actually been having a mild winter too. This is just a Arctic front that has rolled all the way down. My son in Louisiana is actually expecting today and tomorrow into tomorrow 5, maybe even 6 inches of snow in southern Louisiana, and temperatures well below freezing. So quite unusual for them, but this front is affecting most of our country. So it is pretty crazy. Serena saying, will moving pots during freezing weather help kill grubs and other pests? Possibly. It depends on the grub. So a grub is a larva, typically of a beetle that is native to our garden area, and it may or it may not. If it's a pot that is normally growing in a warm place and you put it outside, then yeah, it might kill the grubs. But my beds freeze solid. My pots freeze solid every single winter. And every single spring, I've got grubs. I have those larvae that is prevalent throughout my bed. So many of these insects will lay their eggs in the soil, and the soil itself really only gets to freezing. So while our temperatures outside, the air temperature may be absolutely frigid to the point that it is cold. I go outside every morning without a jacket on to get my paper, walk the dogs a little bit, and come inside, even when it's severely cold. Today, it affected me. So when I went back outside, I did put my coat on to stay warm. So I have a good feeling about the temperature and can handle a lot of cold. Not today. Today it's absolutely frigid. But the soil that is frozen is really not going to be the same temperature as the air temperature, especially when it's covered with snow. The soil temperature is only going to be around 0 Celsius or 32 Fahrenheit. And so those grubs may be frozen, but they're not necessarily going to die because that larva has developed to the point that they can handle those cold conditions. So it depends on what kind of grub it is. It depends on where the pots came from, but it really isn't that effective of a way to kill the grubs. If you can, depending on what's in the pot, just dump out the pot and you'll see the grubs, and pluck out the grubs, and then you kill them. That's really a much more effective way if you've got grubs in your pots, if you can do that, than to hope that the weather's going to kill them, because most of them have developed to be able to handle the cold. And that's why they're buried in the soil in the winters, because they can handle those frozen conditions and still survive to wake up in the spring and then climb out and then affect your plants. So, oh, Heidi says that Serena said that Jay mentioned she's not feeling well. So I'm sorry to hear that, Jay. I hope you're watching, or you'll watch on replay, and know that we are thinking about you and hope that you feel better. I'm so sorry to hear that. And I know that many of us are bouncing back and forth, particularly this time of year, winter here in the US, and having to overcome some of these sicknesses and illnesses. So my positive warmth, healing energy is going out to all of you. Bohemian Herbology Natural Solutions says those are exactly the main points for sure. It's a breeding project for local gardens with the space. And that's back to Landrace gardening, of course. I think Landrace gardening is one of those things that many of us are practicing, though we may not be aware of it. And so my first exposure to this, and I didn't even realize that it was what could be attributed to landrace gardening, was when I grew columbines, a flower, 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, when I was first starting to get into some flower gardening, and I had a bed and I had columbines as my flower of choice. And I think I grew 4, maybe 5 different varieties of columbine. Now, the Rocky Mountain columbine, the purple and white flower, is actually the state flower of Colorado. And so that was one high on the list that I wanted to grow. So I grew that. But then I grew columbines of all different kinds of colors. So 4 or 5 different varieties, different colors, with the purple and white one as the most prominent one that I wanted to grow. I grew them. They flowered. They were beautiful. I left them in the ground. I let the seeds fall, and the next year just let them naturally grow again. And most of them came back again with the different colors. But after about 3 or 4 years, I noticed that I had lost completely some of those that had most of the colors. And I now know, looking back on it, that some of those columbines that I was growing were hybrid varieties. And I didn't fully understand the concept of hybrids more than 20 years ago. And by letting those seeds fall to the ground, I was losing some of the primary characteristics of the color of the flower, which was the reason I put them in the first place. But what resulted was more homogeneous. I still had columbines throughout the bed, but they were more subtly colored. And there was a prevalence of those purple and white columbine flowers. And so the bed basically naturalized. It found a point where the strongest plants were the ones that grew, and those were the flowers that I was seeing. And essentially, that's the idea behind landrace gardening. If you are allowing an area of your landscape to naturalize and to let the plants cross-pollinate and drop seed and grow again, what's going to result is going to be the strongest plants for your garden, the plants that can handle those freezing conditions that some of us have in winter, or those boiling hot summers that some of us have. Not all plants can handle those conditions. Even if you're buying the plant from a nursery and they assure you that's going to be okay, it's not always the ideal plant. So by allowing the plants to naturalize and the strongest to develop is really the concept behind it. Now, when we're starting our own seeds, you can combine both of those things we're talking about now. When to start our seeds and the idea of saving some of these hybridized seeds, and go ahead and save some of those seeds and either start them outdoors or start them indoors. When we are talking about the perennial flowers, one thing to think about is they're probably going to need exposure to some of those cold conditions. They're going to need the cold stratification. So that's why I like to just spread my seeds out in late fall, early winter, early spring, and then let them naturally develop, because they're going to need exposure to the cold. That's not the case with the annual flowers that we're typically growing. They're probably not going to need that cold. But if you are saving some of those seeds from some of those hybridized plants, you can start them well in advance of your last frost date and see what kind of germination you get, and actually kind of get a head start on the plants to see if the plant is something that you like. And if it is, well, now you've saved those seeds and you can go further to put them in your garden or put them in pots or whatever it is that you have chosen to do with the seeds that you're growing. And Bohemian Herbology goes on to say, I've bred my own tomatoes and squash. I've contributed to the cucumber project this year. Awesome. The distinction Gardner Scott makes are so true. Thanks again for the great question. I'm so glad to hear that. And so that's why I say, and I can kind of read in your words how excited that you are about having done that, because it is exciting. Yeah, I've talked about the Galileo Moon tomato that I've been developing over many years now. It's fun when you start seeing something different develop in your garden and you start doing it on purpose, start developing some of those new varieties that nobody else has because they originated in your garden, and it's your garden that is the one that is moving it forward. And if it's successful, you can still share the seeds with your friends and have them do well with the same plant. Before you know it, it's something that you can all talk about and eat, and then compare your gardens with all these different plants. Big Will Dog's asking, what variety of garlic seems to be your most cold or your most hardy, which seem to laugh at your coldest winter temps? So music, I talked about music garlic recently. It's my favorite, and probably the most, well, absolutely the most successful. Now, when I choose my garlic, I typically am choosing the Russian purples and the varieties that are suitable for cold conditions. They do fine in my garden, and I'm harvesting generally at about the point that the summer is at its peak and we're hitting the highest temperatures, and they all seem to do okay. But when it comes to the clove I put in the ground resulting in a bulb, I'd say music. Pretty much 100% of the cloves I put in, I get as bulbs. And I can't say that with all of the other varieties that I put in the ground. And so we'll use garlic as an example. We're not technically putting the seed in the ground, we're putting the clove in the ground. But this gets back to the topic of the day of when to put our seeds in. And garlic, for most of us, goes in the ground in fall. I put my garlic in the ground in October, and I'm harvesting usually in July. There are a lot of seeds that follow that same profile. So I've been looking at a lot of videos from the UK in the last couple of weeks because many of them are actively involved with seed sowing. Tony O'Neill at Simplified Gardening just had a video a few days ago where he was showing the seeds that he's doing in his polytunnel. And so as I was starting the show today, talking about the gradual increase of temperature and how your nights might get close to that frost point, and a little bit of protection is all you need. There are many gardeners in the UK that are in that situation right now. They're growing in their greenhouse, they're growing in their polytunnel. Eli and Kate in the garden are doing the same thing. They did a video recently in the greenhouse, starting the seeds. Still much too cold for me, still much too soon for me. But when you have that kind of environment, you can start your seeds early. And some of the discussion that I've had with some of my UK gardener friends and through some of these videos is many of the seeds that they start in their gardens actually go in October, November, December, with the expectation that they may or may not germinate, but they'll start growing in late winter, early spring. And then by the time the summer garden comes, those plants are growing. And so you do need to understand your local environment and follow the guidance of your local gardening experts. I certainly couldn't do that here in Colorado, snow covered most of the winter and the late freezes that we get. But if you live in an environment like much of the UK, you could get away with that. And so my friends in Scotland and Wales and England in particular, they're actively starting seeds right now, many of them. I say, do it, go for it. I'm a bit jealous when it comes to doing that because it's suitable for your climate and suitable for the types of plants that you're growing. And that's really important, is matching the plants we want to grow with our environment and then finding out what is the best time for us to put them in. Now, when you look at that seed packet, you'll see that some of the seeds we're putting in our garden will give you an option. So for those cucumbers and those squashes and those melons, it might say to start the seed 2 to 3 weeks before your last frost date indoors, or to direct sow outdoors 2 to 3 weeks after the last frost date. When do you want to start your seeds? When do you want the plant to develop? Now, in my experience, and I experimented a little bit with this last year with my cucumbers, if I start my cucumbers indoors about 3 weeks before the last frost date, or if I start them from seed about 2 to 3 weeks after the last frost date, I'm looking at the soil temperature to really make that determination. And it needs to be warming up to the point where it's at least 60 degrees Fahrenheit, about 15 Celsius, for me to put the plants in the ground or to put the seeds in the ground. So by the time I'm putting the plant in the ground, I've put the seed in soil indoors. It takes 5 days maybe for it to germinate. So by the time the plant is going in the ground, the plant is about a month old. If I put a seed in that same bed, you would think that the plant has a 30-day head start. Well, it's not quite that black and white. The seed that's outdoors in warm soil now will germinate. It's exposed to the sunlight, the heat, the water, the great nutrients within the soil. And for a period of time, that cucumber that has a month head start will grow better, will grow faster, and it will fruit sooner. But in my experience, at least in my garden, it's not giving me a cucumber a full month early. It's only giving me a week, maybe 2 weeks of a head start on my season. And by the end of the season, the seeds that I direct sowed, generally those plants are doing better and will give more fruit. I think it's because the transplanting process is stressful on the plant. Some of the roots are going to be broken. The plant does need to recover from the transplanting before it then starts growing and flowering and fruiting. And so ultimately, the question becomes, is that 1 or 2 week advantage worth it to go through the full starting indoors and then hardening off and then transplanting versus just starting the seeds outdoors? I find it much easier just to sow outdoors after my last frost date when the soil has warmed up. They start slow, but then the plants just take off. And same was true for my squashes, same was true for my melons. They all seemed to go pretty slowly in June last year after I had put the seeds in the ground. But by the end of the season, they were all doing great, ample harvests, everything was wonderful. So for you, determining when to start your seeds, take that into account. Many of these seeds that we can direct sow in our garden will do very well if we direct sow them in our garden. And while you can start them early, is it worth the effort? Is it worth the outcome? And if that 2 weeks is critical for you, if your season is so short it makes a difference, then I say go for it. And so, talking with my UK friends and watching those UK videos, they often will start seeds indoors that I would never even think about doing. Peas, for instance, are one of those that I always direct sow. But when you are in a cold, cool environment like Scotland, for instance, those extra couple weeks can make a big difference in your season. And so starting some of those plants indoors that the rest of us don't even think about because we have a really hot summer and it lasts long enough to reach harvest, I'm not as worried about that 1 or 2 weeks, but you might be. So add that to your consideration when it comes time to decide whether you're going to even start the seeds beforehand or go with a direct sowing method. Masabi Gal saying, in my extreme cold, I've been throwing snow into the greenhouse to keep the beds moist. That's not a bad idea. I figure the warm spells will melt it and keep the soil plants moist. It's -8 Fahrenheit. That's cold. It's about -22 in there today. And so I talk about this in one of my recent greenhouse videos from last month, I think it was. I take my watering can and I do the same thing. I take the watering can and keep the soil and my green stock that's in the greenhouse watered during this time of year. I've been experimenting and working to try to keep my temperature warmer than that because it does get frigid. And I think the snow is a great idea. I've got enough snow on the ground right now that shoveling some snow in there actually will save me a few trips with that watering can. But great idea. Absolutely great idea to keep the soil moist. I've talked about this in a few of my videos when I talk about the soil and the soil life. And the idea being that you want your soil life to stay alive, and it needs moisture to do that. And so if you're not doing anything to your soil in your greenhouse over the course of the winter, it's going to dry out. It's going to desiccate, probably kill a lot of the beneficial microbes that are in that soil. They'll recover, but if you can keep the soil moist, often even in really cold conditions, the soil life will still be alive. And when it does warm up, they're ready to go and they'll start repopulating the bed in absolutely no time. So great idea to do that and to keep the beds as moist as possible, even during cold days. And yeah, shovel the snow. Once the sun comes out, greenhouse is going to get warm. My greenhouse during these sunny days, right now it's kind of cloudy, but the last couple of days sunny, my greenhouse has easily reached 80 Fahrenheit, 27 Celsius during the day, even with the outside air temperature below freezing. So sun and greenhouses are really pretty incredible when it comes time to think about the variable temperatures we have. And so if you can do something like I've done with the water and maybe some supplemental heat, you can keep the temperatures at or just slightly below freezing. And any snow you put in there will probably melt pretty quickly. Okay, let's see. I'm going to try to scroll down and get close to the real time. I'm now kind of a little bit behind with the comments. Rick is saying, onions, I plant my seeds, onions. I plant my seeds in a pot to transplant later. Saves weeding, good idea. Love putting the root in soil from the onion. Some use for greens, but if you leave, you can get small onions. Yeah, that's the nice thing about the onions is you can harvest and eat onions at any point in their life. And so putting the seeds in a pot, either indoors or outdoors, great option. And I love the idea, particularly in warm environment, of starting your seeds in pots outdoors. I keep talking about indoors versus outdoors with the assumption being that we're going to be starting our seeds either indoors or direct sowing. But no, you can start your seeds in a pot outdoors or in a pot in your greenhouse if your greenhouse is warm enough, and then transplant into the garden later. And it does save weeding. If you direct sow in the garden, the conditions that are encouraging the germination and the growth of those young seedlings are the same conditions that the weed seeds are going to need. And so, yeah, either indoors or outdoors, when you start the seeds in a different container, great idea, Rick. Definitely cuts down on the weeding if you can then move to the transplanting later on. Allotment of the Dead says, only problem with UK weather is the lack of heat, especially for chilies and aubergines. Yeah, and so when we talk about those temperatures and the variability, I've got hot, cold, as opposed to cool and then warm and a more gradual change, is those plants that need that warmth. When we're starting our seeds, and that's one reason why the chilies and the aubergines in particular are going to be started indoors, because they need the heat. They need often a heat mat. If you're going to be growing the chili peppers, if you use a heat mat, you're going to get faster germination and probably more successful germination of your seeds. And even the aubergines, the tomatoes, all those plants that we're going to be starting indoors can benefit from that little bit of heat. The outside heat factor is still important. And so when we talk about like the UK weather, we've started these seeds indoors under heat mats. They're doing great. The plants are beautiful. They're ready to go outside. They need warm conditions to go into. And the UK doesn't always have those warm conditions. And so while I'm growing my chilies and my aubergines, my eggplants outdoors because I have nice, sunny, warm days, what you'll see often in some of these environments where it's cool and cloudy and they don't have the heat is they're growing almost extensively indoors. And so this last week, I was on a live stream with the Grow Up channel, and a number of us, they're all from the UK, from Wales and England in particular, and me. And we're talking about some of these plants that they're already starting, that they're already growing. And we were talking about the differences. And so these plants that I'm talking about, that I'm growing outdoors in my garden, often direct sowing, or if I start from seed and then transplant, they're going outside. That's not the case, as the allotment of the dead points out. There's a lack of heat generally in the UK weather, which means you might not be able to be growing some of these as effectively outside. And particularly the chili peppers, you're going to see those in a polytunnel or in a greenhouse. And that may be your only option if you want to have successful plants. So that's why I say it's so important to understand your own environment and to make sure that you're matching your methods of gardening with what your climate is giving you. It matches for me. I can grow outdoors. My greenhouse gets so hot in the summer that I can't grow those plants in my greenhouse because it's just too hot. Complete reverse. If any of you remember my videos with Eli and Kate from a couple years ago when we were growing tomatoes, the tomatoes I'm growing outdoors, she's growing in her greenhouse, and it's because of the temperatures in the UK for her in Scotland. She was surprised, quite surprised, that she actually did have some success growing tomato plants outdoors. They'd never done that before. It was a new experience to them. And I was a little surprised that I was able to ventilate and keep my greenhouse a little bit cool enough to be able to grow some tomatoes in my greenhouse. So it takes a little bit of extra effort to be able to do something that's different than what you would normally do. It often can be done, but the easy approach is just to find out what the other gardeners are doing, what the experienced gardeners are doing, what you should be doing, and then trying to match all of that up. And it usually works out. Shiloh G says, ask myself that same question, and I ended up with grow tents. Now I can grow whatever I want all winter. I still find myself getting ahead of myself for my outdoor garden. And so, yeah, grow tents. I've got my grow tent. I covered that a couple years ago in some videos as well. And think about that. If you're struggling growing outdoors and trying to match up when to start seeds and when to transplant seeds, and then trying to match the plant with whether it's in a greenhouse or outside in the sun, you might be able to just bypass that whole thing and just do indoor growing in a grow tent. Grow tent space is limited. Depending on where you have a grow tent, you probably aren't able to grow nearly as much indoors as outside, but it is a viable option for doing something that allows you to have a successful harvest year round. And I loved being able to harvest some of my peppers that I was growing in my grow tent indoors when it's cold and snowy outside. So yeah, definitely something to consider when you are looking at those kind of options. Barbara's asking, I live in Northeast Pennsylvania, zone 5B6A, and was planning on trying winter sowing this week for the first time. Have you tried this method, and do you have any tips or suggestions? Yeah, I have a video on winter sowing if you're talking about doing it in the gallon jugs. And so, yeah, I have a video where I show that method that I've done before. So these days, when I talk about winter sowing, most of what I do is just scatter the seeds in an area where I want those seeds to grow. It's easy. and I just let nature take its course and germinate those seeds. But when we talk about the type of winter sowing, where you take like a gallon milk jug and you cut it in half, you put the bottom half filled with a good potting mix, and then you put the seeds in, and then put those outdoors during the winter months. The concept is essentially the same. You're putting your seeds outdoors and waiting for nature to wake up that seed, waiting for the air temperature to get warm enough and for the amount of sunlight to be enough for those plants to start growing. And it can be very effective. I know gardeners that do 100 jugs of seeds during the winter months. They just scatter them around their garden and just have dozens and dozens of the jugs. The hardest part about it, and the reason that I typically don't do more than 6 or 10, and it's usually only those seeds that need the cold stratification, and I put them in a location close to where I'm going to transplant them. The most important thing and kind of the hardest thing is keeping them moist. And so what's going to happen, especially in a dry region like mine here in Colorado, they're going to dry out. That dry air is going to suck the moisture out of those milk jugs. So even during the winter, if you have a spell of warm days, you're probably going to have to go water that soil to keep it moist so that those seeds will germinate and so the plants will start growing. So that's one of the more difficult aspects of winter sowing when you're doing it in the jug system during the winter months, is keeping that soil moist, because you can easily oversaturate the soil as well. So you've got the likelihood of it drying out if you do nothing, and you've got a very real possibility that you're going to drown everything if you just water on a regular basis. So the way I do it is to have like a hinge on the plastic jug, and I'll open it up periodically and check before I water to see if it even needs water at all. And then beyond that, it's pretty simple. The seed will germinate, the seedling will start growing, all in its own course. And before you know it, you've got plants growing in these jugs. If you have really hot spells, you may need to prop open the jug. You may need to open it so it doesn't overheat during the day, because you're creating a little mini cold frame. The cloche, the heat that's developed within that system, can burn those young seedlings. So be aware of that if you're doing something like winter sowing, you've got to be right on top of things when the water is concerned, and you need to be on top of it to open it up so it doesn't overheat when those seeds or when those seedlings are still very, very small. So those are probably the top two things that I would say to be aware of as you start practicing the winter sowing, and have fun with it. It is one of those things, and that's what's so amazing about nature is you'll put your jugs out in November, December, January, February, whenever it is, and it's still cold. It's still maybe snowy, and you've got faith that it's going to work. So much of gardening is all about faith. So you have the faith that it's going to work. And then suddenly one day you walk out in maybe late February or early March, and there are plants growing in those jugs. There may still be snow on the ground, and you've got plants growing in those jugs. So it's just crazy. When the conditions are right, the seeds will germinate and they'll start growing. And it's often surprising, very surprising, how early that growth absolutely happens. So you gotta go out every day and check on them to make sure that you don't burn them and to make sure that they don't dry out. And then hopefully you'll definitely have some success with that. Serena asks, any plans to do an indoor grow tent over winter video? So I have done that. So I don't have any plans to do another one, because I already have a few of those videos that show how I set up the grow tent and how I was growing my peppers and tomatoes in the grow tent. So yeah, check those out, Serena, because I already have those videos that may give you some answers if you've got any questions about growing in a grow tent. Very, very easy. I found that I kept my grow tent open. So it has a zippered door. I generally just left the door open. I would leave it closed to help with the humidity, to help keep the humidity up a little bit while the seeds were germinating and the initial growth of the seedlings. But once the plants started growing, I just left the door open, and it made it so much easier to tend to those plants and to see how well they were doing as well. So uh, it's easy and actually really fun to go down and harvest a pepper during the middle of winter. Mobius 981 is asking, requesting video on indoor veg gardening, like with tents and lights for winter gardening for us cold people. Okay, there you go. Same basic idea. Okay, I've done those grow tent videos, but I'll definitely move that topic up my list and maybe start doing a few more of those videos while it's still cold out. I also have some videos on hydroponics. So I show you how I was doing my hydroponics. I used the hydroponics to grow things like lettuce and spinach during the winter months as well. But yeah, I'll think about maybe doing some more of those videos because it has been a few years since I made those videos. Pat Patrick says, first year to use the Planter app. Looking forward to using it in all aspects of my gardening from starting to harvest. Fantastic, Pat. And if you don't know about the Planter app, I actually have a link in the description below. You can check it out. And I've got a couple videos talking about the Planter app. I love it. I've got it on my phone. I also have it on my PC. And that's the nice thing about the Planter app is during these cold months, I can set on my PC and actually set up some of the stuff on the app and then go out to the garden. And you can plan your whole garden and be able to look at it on your phone. So you can plan where the seeds are going to go, what plants are going in what beds. And then when you go out in your garden, you just pull out your phone on planting day and you know exactly where everything's going to go. That's exactly what I did with my pepper bed last year because I had a number of different varieties in the pepper bed and I figured out what the spacing was going to be. And I used the Planter app to keep everything organized when it came time to actually put the plants in the bed. So I think you'll like it, Pat. It all comes down to how much you're going to use it. Now, they've made so many improvements to the app since I've made those videos that it really is incredible. The thing that I'd really like to do, and this is what I will often use my PC for, is great library of information. So if you're going to put a squash in a particular bed and it's a particular variety of squash, the Planter app may already have that variety in their database. And so all you do is just import it from the database, put it into your garden plan, and now that variety is in place. Because I do a lot of unique varieties and a lot of experimentation growing plants that a lot of other people don't grow, it also allows me to modify the database and to put in my own data. So with some of those peppers that I was growing, a lot of them were actually already in the database. But the ones that weren't, all I had to do was just create a new entry. And now I've added that variety to my database and have incorporated it into my plan. So really good. And so when we talk about when to start the seeds, that's another advantage to using an app like the Planter app is you can enter in your last frost date. Remember, an important date. So you put your last frost date into your profile on your Planter app, and then it will tell you when you should start seeds, indoors or out, based on those varieties that you've chosen to put into your bed. So I talk about using a seed packet just because I like taking the seed packets out in the garden and having all that information at hand. But the Planter app is the same thing and actually more information in your hand when it comes to starting the seeds and when to start the seeds. And it's all based on your last frost date. So glad to hear that, Pat. For those of you that haven't tried it, yeah, check out that link below. There's a discount associated with that if you choose to get the app. And it really is one of those fun things to be able to have your garden in your pocket at any moment, to be able to pull out and remind yourself of what you're growing and when you're supposed to get them started. If you're anything like me, over all these many years of gardening, you have this great plan in place for when you're going to start your seeds. And then you go to check your calendar and realize you were supposed to start the seeds last week. That's the nice thing about having them in having the plan in your pocket, is if you get in that habit of regularly checking it, you can be notified and, oh, it's time to start my seeds, and not miss out on a full week. There's Tony from Simplified Gardening. I was just talking about you, mate, telling everybody to check out your most recent video since we're talking about seeds in the garden. Now, one of the things that Tony mentions in that video that I think is really important, and I touched on it briefly when I was talking about brassicas and peas versus some of those plants like the squashes and the melons, is understanding that the seeds that can, or the plants that can handle cold conditions, are often the seeds that can handle cold conditions. And the plants that can't handle cold at all are the kind of seeds that need warmth. So if you're growing spinach and lettuce and radishes and peas and all of the brassicas, they can handle frosty conditions with no problem in your garden, which means that you can start those seeds before your last frost date. And the cool thing, I talked about this last week briefly, the cool thing about many of these seeds is that they will germinate when it's cold out. If your soil temperature is 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 4.5 Celsius, that's too cold for most of our summer garden seeds to germinate. But it's warm enough for many of those cool season plants to begin germinating. It's going to take a while. It takes longer for them to germinate when it's that cold compared to the warmer temperatures, but they can still germinate. And so it's just amazing how these seeds can be so cold and still grow into a plant. And the air temperature can be so cold and the plant will keep growing. The sunlight is a factor. So if you're growing in a polytunnel or a greenhouse, be aware that there might not be enough sunlight to get the best growth, to get the maximum amount of growth from the plant. But as soon as the sun hits that magic point that plant needs, it skyrockets. I used to love doing that at the Galileo School. We would put seeds in the ground at the end of one semester. So generally the beginning of December, we would be sowing seeds. And then everyone would go on the holiday break and then come back at the beginning of the next year. And when they would come out to the garden again in mid to late January, most of those seeds had germinated. And this is an unheated greenhouse. It gets below freezing, and we would still have germination because the soil would be warmed up by the daily sun. They would stay small all through January, all through February. They would still be small plants. And then magically, the beginning of March, there's enough sunlight that they just shoot up into the sky. The plants begin to grow so dramatically and almost quite literally overnight because they get enough light. So when we're talking about when to start our seeds, even if we can start our seeds during the cool months, just realize that the seed may germinate and will probably start growing, but the rate of growth is going to be affected by how much light they're getting. And so if you want more growth, you're going to need supplemental lighting. If you're just waiting for the sun, it may be a while. It may be weeks before you see some of that growth that you were hoping for in the plants. And that's normal. Don't think you're doing something wrong when you start seeds that early and you just can't figure out why they're not growing. It's because they don't have enough light. You have to get that light for the plant to really hit its full potential. And that really is an important factor. For me, during this time of year when I'm starting seeds, especially when it comes to the winter sowing that we were just talking about, that's why I prefer to do it indoors. I like seeing that growth. I like seeing the plant develop. And that's because I've got them under lights and I can see that growth. It's not as prevalent when you're doing it outdoors. And so it can still be fun, it can still be successful. Just be aware that there is going to be a difference between those two situations that you're growing in. So uh, the other thing I wanted to talk about when it comes to when to start the seeds. So I talked about the last frost date, using a seed packet or the planter app. And one of the methods that I still use, even with my planter app, is a calendar. I don't often use a calendar for anything except seed starting. And I'm talking about a paper calendar, the kind that's got a pretty picture on the top and the month below. I will occasionally get a calendar from some charitable organization that I've given money to. I use that to start my seeds. And it just feels good. I've been doing it that way for years and years and years. So it just feels good because I can plan. I can look at a glance my entire month, which days I'm going to be hard, or which days I'm going to be planting, which days I'm going to be transplanting. I still like that. Yes. Is it more effort to take that information and also put it into the planter app? Sure. But I'm not carrying my calendar outside. So I'm using my calendar along with my seed catalogs as just something to keep that gardening spirit alive during these cold, frigid days. And I, uh, and even though it's still old school, it's still one of those things that I do enjoy doing. Dwayne is saying Alberta has a climate similar to Colorado. Can plants in a greenhouse endure in really cold temperatures? So it depends on the plant. It always depends on the plant. And so what's growing in my greenhouse right now, I have a green stock tower with strawberries. Strawberries are still green. They're still growing. I actually had some fruit in December on those strawberry plants. I've got Chicago fig trees, and the fig trees have actually started to grow. There's little buds that are developing and little leaves that are developing. And that's because so far my winter has been relatively mild. And so the coldest temperature in my greenhouse until this cold snap was about 25 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about -4 Celsius. And so at that temperature, the strawberries did okay. The fig trees did okay. They didn't die because they can handle the cold temperatures. When I had the tomatoes and peppers growing in my greenhouse until last month, when those temperatures hit, all the peppers and all the tomatoes were zapped by that temperature in particular. So it depends on what you're growing in the greenhouse. Some can handle those cold temperatures. The spinach, the radish, the lettuce, the kale, all the brassicas that you might want to be growing in your greenhouse, they can handle temperatures down to that point. Now, I have been experimenting with some supplemental heat in my greenhouse to avoid temperatures much lower than that. And so, as I found last year and the year before, without supplemental heat, my greenhouse temperature gets severely cold. Last year, I think the coldest, after I put the water barrels in, the coldest I got last year was 5 degrees Fahrenheit, -15 Celsius inside the greenhouse. that's too cold for just about anything that you're going to be growing. So it it depends on the plants. It depends if you have a supplemental heat source. It depends on whether you have that passive heating system like I do with the water. Those are all factors to consider as to whether they can endure the cold temperatures in the greenhouse. And so for me, uh, this winter has actually been kind of eye-opening as I am experimenting a little bit with more of the temperature control during the winter. And I'm actually kind of surprised. You'll see some videos on this coming out if you're interested in my greenhouse videos. I'm actually quite surprised at seeing how easy, relatively, it is to keep a greenhouse warm. It's not necessarily cheap. There's some expense involved, but it's doable. And so next year I'll be experimenting a little bit more, and I may actually try to grow some more of these plants in my greenhouse later, still recognizing that there's not enough sunlight during these cold months for the plants to do well. But a pepper plant, rather than digging up a pepper plant and overwintering it indoors, if I can have a pepper plant stay alive inside my greenhouse over the winter, in effect, I've overwintered it and now gotten a head start on the next year's growing season. And that's kind of my goal. That's why I'm doing it, is to be able to keep my plants alive during the winter in an unheated greenhouse. It just needs a help during some of the coldest times of the year, like we're getting right now. This is definitely crazy cold. Shiloh G says, don't know if you already discussed, but are you going to be doing a video on what you're growing this year? I have some of those giant crimson you wanted last year. So yeah. In fact, I've actually already been laying out the video and just trying to decide when I'm going to release it. I'm thinking the first week of February is when the video is going to come out. And yeah, absolutely, I'll be doing it. One of the things that I'm going to be doing this year is to focus on seeds that I already have or can get without buying new seeds, because I have so many seeds. And so one of the things, to your point, is I want to have some beds in my garden this year that are devoted to seeds that have been given to me. And then the rest of the beds are going to be beds using seeds that I already have, that are in my seed collection from the last 5 years in particular. So I'll be sharing the specific varieties in that video here in a few weeks, but that's the idea. And so, yeah, giant crimson is definitely something I would be interested in, along with some of the ones that some of you have sent me in the last year or two. And I'll be trying some of those seeds and trying to avoid the compulsion of buying new seeds. I love buying new seeds. I love experimenting with new varieties. Last year, that's all I did was new varieties. It was fantastic. I discovered so many wonderful things. And that's why this year I want to take all those wonderful things that I've discovered, those wonderful varieties and the plants that did so well in my garden, and shift the focus to a garden that is plants I know they're going to do well, and then see how it all plays out. I like the experimentation. There'll still be a little experimentation this year with some of those varieties that have been given to me that I haven't grown before. But the idea is trying to refine what it is you grow in your garden. And that's why I'm making videos about this. And that's why I'll be talking more about it. It doesn't have to be all new and doesn't have to be all old, but finding that happy medium for the plants that you grow each year. So when you get to be an old, experienced gardener and you want to just keep it easy and keep it simple, you know what it is that's going to do well in your garden. And that's kind of the basis for this shift this year, is to try to start working in that direction. I'm not saying I'm old and want to make it too easy on myself, but I think it is beneficial when we can say, these are what I like to grow. When someone asks me a question, what's your favorite tomato? I can say black Krim, because I've discovered over the years that it's my favorite tomato to grow. It's not necessarily my favorite tomato to eat. I love the sun gold. I love sharing the sun gold with my granddaughters. It's their favorite tomato to eat. So there's different reasons we grow different plants. Having those favorites in your hip pocket, like I mentioned with the Black Beauty zucchini, knowing what they are makes it really easy when it comes to garden planning, because you probably already have the seeds and you can put your plan together so much easier, just a couple minutes, rather than having to do research to figure out if a plant's going to do well in your garden. Robin Gardens, hello to you. Old school works well for me on the overall garden plan too. Drawing things out is therapeutic. Thank you for saying that. I do find it a bit therapeutic. I love taking the planter app out to my garden and seeing which bed is supposed to be in planted in which plants. But yeah, I love taking the grid paper out as well and drawing the little boxes for the beds and drawing little circles for which plants are going to go in the beds. I do find that therapeutic. Maybe it's that art aspect. I'm not an artist by any stretch, but maybe it gets back to that little bit of artistic drawing on a piece of paper that triggers something in our brain that does become a little bit of a therapy. So I like that idea. And I'll still continue to do that. Shout out to Venice Weeks, a new member of the Gardner Scott community. Great to have you join us all. Check out all those perks that the membership gives you and join in on the discussion of some of the things that we're doing in the garden training mode that you are in. There will be a members only live stream that'll be coming up probably early next week, or actually maybe later this week. And so you'll be able to participate in the Gardner Scott community members only live stream, which is a lot of fun. And we get together and answer all the questions. And then of course there's the Facebook group and lots of fun things to look into. So glad you're here and glad you have joined us. That's fantastic. And thank you, Heidi, for seconding that. And also thank you for the support of the channel as well. Okay. Tony is saying, I have boxes and boxes of seed and don't want to throw the older ones because they are still mostly viable. I hear you, mate. And that's exactly why this year I decided to make that shift. So for those of you that don't know, and maybe didn't see all the videos, last year I planted 50 new varieties of seeds. I didn't plant anything last year that I had grown before. The year before, I grew probably about 50 varieties of plants. The year before that, about 50 varieties of plants. The year before that, about 50 varieties of plants. When you add it all up, and I've shown this in some of my videos about this obsession, this compulsion, I've got hundreds and hundreds of seed packets. And like Tony, I don't want to throw them away just because they might be old seeds. Old seeds can still be viable. So I'm reverting back to those boxes of seeds that I have as well. And I'll probably be focused on some of those older ones because their viability will be reduced. But it's so easy to become a seed collector and not a seed sower when you are a gardener that just loves starting seeds. So that's why I'm doing that shift this year. And it's getting close to time. So I talked about earlier. So I'll be doing some pansies and some petunias this year. And it's about time for me to start because I want to put some of those plants in the ground that are already flowering. I created some new beds last year with the intent that those would be showcase beds, my rock beds, for instance, my stone beds. I want those to be filled with annuals. So if I can grow some of those plants early in the season so that I can put them in as flowering plants that'll keep me in color for the whole season. I think that's fantastic. And I got to pull out all those packets and check on their viability and get them started, because I've been planning on doing these pansies and petunias for a couple years now. So I've been acquiring these seeds for a few years now and haven't done this project. So it's time. It's time to actually start doing it. Rutilation says, great chat. I wish I was in a better headspace, but as I near the end of my seeding window for almost everything I want to grow, I'm feeling defeated as I prepare to reseed my trays for the 5th time. I'm so sorry to hear that. So I hope this discussion can help you a little bit. I've got so many videos on starting seeds. The things we talked about last week, as far as when you or how you start your seeds. Most seeds don't need anything special, which is why I just use a basic seed starter mix like I show in my videos. And then I'll move to a potting mix that's got the nutrients. But it's about the water, it's about the light, it's about the heat, and it's about a nice loose mix so the seeds have the oxygen. And that's all the seeds need. And so each time, if you've had 5 times of reseeding, I would ask that each time you pause and try to figure out what it was that wasn't working. It could be old seeds. Tony and I have both talked about this. Viability of seeds remains strong for most seeds, often for years, but there does reach a time when the seeds are no longer viable and the germination rate is abysmally low. That could be an issue. It could be that the seeds are dead because of how they were stored or where you got the seeds from. So there's a lot of factors. If they're germinating and not growing, then it's probably the conditions that they're growing in. If they're not germinating at all, then it's also the conditions that the seed is being exposed to. And it could be as simple as just a warmer temperature to get the seeds to germinate. So stick with it. Don't give up. I know it's so difficult as a gardener to get into a bad space because things aren't going right, but it's fun when it does. And it may be a lot of work. I've talked occasionally about, and I was reminded recently about this 10 years ago, maybe closer to 15 years ago. I had a garden fully planted, early summer, things were going great, and a hailstorm hit, devastated everything. Literally knocked all the plants to the ground and destroyed the garden. I had to replant. Some of these were plants that I had started from seed. It was too late to start from seed again. I had to go buy new plants. Started the garden the second time. A couple of weeks go by, garden's looking great. It happened again. Hailstorm destroyed everything in the garden. I started a third time with full-size plants because by then it was past that window of the seeds being able to be started. But I still started those seeds outdoors that I could, and I put full-size plants in, knowing that the season was going to be short. By the end, I got some harvest. I didn't get the full harvest that I was used to, but I got some tomatoes and I got some peppers and I got some squash. I got some of those plants that I so like to have in my summer garden. Not many, because frost comes early here in Colorado, but 3 times completely starting a garden was worth it. And I encourage anyone who's having hardships with either starting seeds or transplanting, don't give up, because all it takes is a single plant to grow and give you what you're looking for. And for me, that's success. That's how I measure success in a garden. If I can harvest a single tomato, my garden has been a success for the year. It's a pretty low threshold, but sometimes, like that year of 3 gardens, it looks like you may not get it, but I got it. And that's why I can talk about this still. I loved the tomatoes I got that year, I loved the successes of the garden that year, even when it kept going wrong over and over again. So gardeners, don't give up. We may want to, we may think that's the best thing to do, but ultimately you got to keep going, because that's what gardening is all about, is continuing to do it as much as possible. Monica, thank you for bringing this up. This was on my list of something to talk about today when we talk about when to start seeds. For anyone who missed it earlier, if you garden by the moon and you live in North America, Monday through Saturday, plant, mow, prune, work on cuttings, and work on soil. Or is that MSAT? Maybe not Monday through Saturday. And so that is a determination. So if you're not aware of it, I'm thinking of doing a video about it this year. Planting by the moon. Now, this is one of those things, I won't say a lot, gardeners who plant by the moon like it. They think it makes a difference. If you're not aware of it, it's all about looking at the moon, whether the moon is full, waning, waxing. Those are all determining factors of when you put the seeds in the ground. I don't plant by the moon or sow seeds by the moon, but I'm thinking about doing it this year, particularly for the video. And the main reason for me is just because I am so focused on the soil temperature and waiting until the soil temperature reaches the point that I can put the seeds in the ground or put the plants in the ground. And that doesn't always coincide with the moon. And I may be losing a week or two, or planting a week or two too early if I'm looking at the moon. So I've been thinking about doing this video for a long time. Maybe it'll happen this year, and I'll talk much more about planting by the moon. There are many gardeners that say it has no effect at all, and there's gardeners that say it has a great effect. So that's why I want to do a video about it. I love covering those kind of topics. So keep in mind some of those things that you also need to do. I think that's Monica's point, is the sowing and planting by the moon is just the first phase of getting the plant in the ground. Beyond that, there are many other things that you'll be doing with those plants based on the moon cycle. And so there's a lot to it. And we're almost out of time, so I'll save that for a better or a time when we have more time to talk about it. So thank you for raising that, Monica, because when we talk about starting our seeds and whatever you use, a calendar, a planting app, you look at your last frost date. The last frost date is still very important. But if you want to look more into this idea of planting by the moon, now you need to synchronize the last frost date with the moon cycle to determine when you're going to put your seeds in the ground, whether they're early or late for the types of plants that they are. And it may work perfectly. You may gain, you may lose a few days, depending on where the cycle is, based on the timing that is suitable for you and your temperature of the soil and all those other things that you might think are important. So something to keep in mind about those kind of things. And so let's see, Shiloh says, I plant by the moon, equinox, solstice, and generally the wheel of the year. I always plant my garlic on the first day of winter. There you go. And I love this idea. And these aren't necessarily things that I do, but I love when gardeners can individualize their garden. I talk all the time about how each garden is unique, and you need to figure out what works best for you in your garden. And so whatever method that is, and to put your garlic out on the first day of winter, if that works for you in your garden, I love that. For me, that's too late in the year. My ground is frozen on the first day of winter. I'm not able to do that. But I do look at the equinox and the solstice when I do some of those those plantings in my garden. And I think it's something to think about. I put my garlic in pretty close to the solstice, and it's not intentional. It just happens to work out. And so if it's close, then I'll say, okay, yeah, this works. Maybe this is a method I can continue in the future. It's kind of just a way to jog your memory and to keep up a cycle so that it's relatively consistent. And when you get your plants in the ground and when you get your seeds started. So I love that idea, Shiloh. And if it's working for you, and keep doing it, because that's what it's all about, is making it work for us in the best way that we can. Because ultimately, if your garden in January is cold and covered by snow, you're not going to be doing much outdoors, but you can still be doing a lot indoors. And that's educating yourself on some of these different methods that others may say to try. Go ahead and try it and see what you think. Figuring out when to start your seeds indoors or outdoors and what the best time is, go ahead and figure it out. I'm already doing it. That's what I do in January. I'll be doing more of it over the course of this next week as I try to finalize what my garden plan actually happens to be. So for me, I use the calendar for a lot of things in my gardening activities and my planning. And it doesn't necessarily have to be warm outside to be doing some of these things. So hope you are able to stay warm on these frigid days that some of us are having. And I hope you're able to actually get some of this gardening stuff done. I think it's so important to have your plan done, have your seeds ready to go long before they need to be sown. It's a little more relaxing. I find it more relaxing because I'm not stressed trying to make it all happen at the last minute. Hope this has been helpful. I hope you are enjoying your gardening day. I hope this will be a great gardening week for you to come. And I'm going to be back next week, same time, same gardening channel. And I hope to see you there. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.